They thought he didn't belong. They thought they knew food. But after the first bite, no one at that table spoke again. The golden light of late afternoon poured through the tall glass walls of the vineyard estate, bathing everything in a warm, amber glow. Outside, the rows of grapevines stretched across rolling hills like lines of poetry written into the earth, swaying gently in the summer breeze. The estate, a sleek blend of modern architecture and rustic charm, stood at the edge of this natural splendor, a monument of wealth carved into nature's silence. Inside, the atmosphere was both elegant and indulgent. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks above the long mahogany table, which had been set for 18. Gold-rimmed plates, impossibly thin wine glasses, and linen napkins folded with geometric precision spoke of a planner who spared no detail. Classical music drifted through hidden speakers, just loud enough to feel expensive. The guests had begun to arrive. They came in sleek black cars with tinted windows, escorted by drivers who opened doors without a word. Men in tailored suits and women in couture gowns stepped out as if exiting stages. Their laughter rang out, smooth and practiced, echoing slightly in the vaulted hall. Most of them knew one another, if not personally, then by reputation. A CEO of a tech startup that had recently gone public. A well-known socialite whose face adorned magazines more often than models. A lifestyle influencer with 10 million followers and a book deal in the works. These were not people used to being told no. They were the kind who whispered commands and had the world move. They greeted each other with cheek kisses and flutes of vintage champagne, casually showing off luxury watches and stories from last week's trip to Monaco or Kyoto. The words private, curated, exclusive floated in the air like perfume. And yet, amidst all this wealth and power, there was something unusual tonight, something unspoken, a mystery. None of the guests knew who would be preparing the dinner. That in itself was a rarity. Usually, the chef's name would be printed in looping script on a velvet invitation, accompanied by a list of credentials that included Michelin stars and mentions in Bon Appetit. But not this time. This time, the only clue had come from the host himself, a reclusive culinary investor named Edward Sterling. Known for spotting food talent long before the world caught on, Sterling was something of a tastemaker's tastemaker. And when he spoke, people listened. He had only said one thing about the evening's meal. This one's different. The phrase lingered in the minds of the guests as they sipped their drinks and exchanged theories like stock tips. Maybe it's a celebrity chef going incognito, someone guessed. Maybe AI is cooking, another joked, drawing a round of polite laughter. But there was an edge in the room, a sliver of uncertainty that some found thrilling and others irritating. People of this caliber were not used to being kept in the dark. Sterling himself stood near the head of the long table, smiling cryptically as he welcomed his guests. Tall, silver-haired, and draped in a linen suit that seemed to cost more than a car, he radiated quiet confidence. He never revealed more than he needed to. And tonight, that silence spoke volumes. The servers, dressed in charcoal gray uniforms, moved like shadows. They offered amuse-bouches and wine pairings, all while evading any question about the chef. Every guest tried at least once. Can you tell me who's cooking? Is the chef from New York? Give me something, darling. Each time, the answer was the same. A polite smile and a quiet, you'll see soon. Outside the kitchen, the heavy doors remained shut. A few guests began to grow restless. Mrs. Langford, a long-standing patron of the arts, and an even longer-standing critic of all things unrefined, arched a manicured brow. If this is some sort of performance art, I hope they've remembered salt, she muttered, earning a smirk from the man seated next to her, Mr. Carmichael, a venture capitalist known for his ruthless takeovers and sharper tongue. "Well," he replied, swirling his wine, "let's hope it's not another modern reinterpretation of comfort food. I've had enough kale dust for a lifetime." Their voices were low, but their tone was unmistakable, amused, condescending, expectant. Still, the kitchen doors did not open. The sun dipped a little lower outside, casting long shadows across the floor. Light danced across the wine glasses, turning the red liquid inside them into something almost sacred. The air inside the room, however, was growing thick not with heat, but with anticipation, and doubt, and quiet judgment dotting the silence before. The first course, the golden hour, began to fade, but behind those kitchen doors, something was being plated carefully, deliberately, something that would change the taste of the evening forever. The clinking of glassware echoed through the room like soft chimes, marking the passage of time between small talk and expectation. Every guest had now taken their place at the long dining table, its polished surface gleaming like still water. Under the chandelier's glow, Edward Sterling, the enigmatic host of the evening, stood at the head of the table like a man who held a secret in his pocket. He made no grand introductions. He had greeted each guest with the same level of calm, charm, a hand on the shoulder here, a quiet joke there. But when asked about the chef, he responded only with a vague twinkle in his eyes and that cryptic phrase, "You'll understand after the first course." He was a man of restraint. In a world obsessed with spectacle, Edward Sterling preferred quiet revolutions. And tonight, his eyes occasionally flickered toward the kitchen doors, not out of anxiety, but in anticipation. Like a magician waiting for the audience to gasp dot, and behind those kitchen doors was Chef Malek. He moved with the quiet grace of someone who had long ago mastered the noise of ambition. No gold medals adorned the walls of his modest prep space. No team of assistants fluttered around him. Alone, he moved between copper pans and white plates with the kind of precision that looked effortless only because it had been honed through decades of invisible labor. He wore a simple, spotless white chef's coat, no embroidery, no name tag. His hands, scarred lightly from years near flame, were steady as he trimmed a microgreen garnish with surgical care. There was no need for him to introduce himself. His food would speak in a language sharper than words. Malik didn't need attention. He had spent years chasing recognition in kitchens, where he was always seen as the diversity hire, never the leader. Where patrons assumed he was the line cook, the dishwasher, anyone but the artist behind the plate. He had earned accolades, but more often silence. And tonight, he would let the silence speak again, in a different way. Meanwhile, at the table, Mrs. Langford was beginning to grow bored. She adjusted the pearl earring on her left ear and sighed just loudly enough to be heard. "This is beginning to feel like a charity dinner," she whispered to Mr. Carmichael, her perfectly lined lips curling into a smirk. She was elegance personified. In a brittle, biting way, her diamond-studded bracelet clinked lightly against her wine glass as she took another sip. Everything about her seemed meticulously chosen to announce class, status, superiority. Even the tilt of her head carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime expecting the world to impress her, and being disappointed when it didn't. She prided herself on her refined palate and her uncanny ability to detect mediocrity. Within a single bite, she had made chefs cry. She wore that reputation like a brooch dot, and across from her sat Mr. Carmichael, a man who didn't bother pretending to be polite. "So let me get this straight," he boomed to the guest next to him, voice slicing through the ambient music. "We're being fed by a mystery chef that no one's ever heard of? Sterling's really rolling the dice tonight." Carmichael didn't whisper. He didn't care who heard. His fortune had been made in acquisitions, cold, swift, and profitable. He was the kind of man who read wine labels out loud just to make sure everyone knew what bottle they were drinking. The kind who judged a meal before the plate even hit the table, when the server placed a tiny amuse-bouche before him, a single bite-sized pastry with a caramelized onion mousse. He lifted it, examined it like it might contain a trick, and muttered, "Better be more than Instagram food." He laughed. No one joined him. Across the table, Sterling observed quietly, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He said nothing, but a slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. He'd seen it all before. The dismissiveness, the casual elitism that oozed from guests like Carmichael and Langford. And yet, he invited them, not for punishment, but for revelation. He believed in the slow burn of surprise, in the undoing of arrogance through undeniable excellence. Sterling wasn't just a patron of fine cuisine. He was a believer in what food could reveal about people, both the one who cooked it and the ones who consumed it. As another round of wine was poured and a second plate was quietly cleared, Sterling glanced once more at the kitchen. Chef Malik was ready. The plate he now held in his hands glistened with a lacquered glaze. Sweet heat from tamarind and habanero balanced on a seared scallop nestled over grits, whipped to the texture of clouds. A whisper of smoked paprika oil curled around the edge. There was soul in this dish, and science, and memory. He wiped the edge of the plate clean, not for aesthetics, but out of reverence. Then he nodded to the server. The door swung open, and the next act began. The first course arrived on silent feet servers, gliding between chairs with trays held at shoulder height, the plated dishes glowing faintly beneath the crystal lights. Each plate was a study in balance. Seared scallop resting atop velvety, stone-ground grits, a thin line of smoked tamarind glaze curling like a ribbon around the edge. A faint dusting of spice glimmered like gold flecks against porcelain. The room paused. Just long enough to register curiosity. Just short enough to resist acknowledgement. Forks lifted. Conversation, however, did not pause. Who trained this one? Came a low voice from Mrs. Langford, her tone dipped in syrup and sarcasm. Bet he makes great barbecue. Mr. Carmichael chuckled into his wineglass, a smug grin playing at the corners of his mouth. Maybe he catered rap battles before this gig. A few around them tittered nervous laughter, polite and complicit. Someone else muttered under their breath, "Hopefully there's hot sauce on standby." You know how they like it. The remarks weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They slid between the linen and glass like quiet daggers, coated in civility, but sharp just the same. The host, Edward Sterling, stood at the end of the table, swirling his wine with calm amusement. He heard the comments, every single one, but offered nothing in response. No rebuke, no defense. Only that same faint, enigmatic smile, as if he were watching not a dinner, but a slow unraveling. In the kitchen, behind the pass-through window, Chef Malik stood watching. He didn't flinch, didn't blink. His face remained unreadable, like the polished blade of a paring knife. The warm glow of the dining room spilled over the counter edge, casting a faint border between two worlds, theirs and his. He had heard every word. But this wasn't the first time. They never said it directly to him. That would take too much courage. Instead, it came in sideways smirks and half-jokes, in the way people said chef like it needed air quotes. The assumption that someone like him was better suited to frying chicken in a food truck than crafting plates in a glass palace. But Malik didn't respond. Not with words. His hands moved instead steady, sure, silent. A paring knife danced through. An heirloom beet, slicing it thin enough to see light through. His wrist flicked, precise and practiced, as he aligned each petal on a salad like a painter layering pigment. His eyes flicked to the clock. Timing mattered. Precision was everything. Emotion had no place at the cutting board. And still, the murmurs floated out from the dining room like smoke through a crack in the door. I wonder how he even got this job. Someone whispered. "Probably a charity case," said another. "He looks like someone I saw at Whole Foods pushing carts." And yet, just behind Malik's prep station, tucked halfway behind a spice rack and hanging slightly crooked, was a photograph. The edges were curling, the colors faded. A team of chefs, maybe 10 or 12 of them, stood shoulder to shoulder in immaculate uniforms in front of a famous restaurant in Lyon, France. At the center, younger but unmistakable, stood Malik back straight, hands clasped, eyes burning. With purpose, it was a Michelin-starred kitchen. He had stood in the heart of it. He had slept on floors and washed his own whites and studied, under legends who spoke only in critique. He had worked through burns, exhaustion, and language barriers. And still, he had risen. But the guests out there, people who judged with their eyes long before their palates, would never imagine that photo could belong to him. They hadn't earned the story behind it. Sterling, arms loosely crossed now, watched. The plate's return scraped clean. He could sense the unease brewing beneath the surface. The flavors were undeniably refined, delicate, yet bold, complex but familiar. It was food that whispered childhood while humming opera. But rather than praise, the room sat in a quiet sort of discomfort, because praise would require admission that they had judged too soon, too shallowly, too predictably. Some guests faked polite smiles. Others leaned into wine refills like liquid excuses. The chatter turned vague and deflective. Only a few glanced back toward the kitchen, as if wondering, who is he really? Still, Malik didn't emerge. Not yet. He continued working in silence, preparing the second course, a roasted duck breast lacquered in molasses thyme reduction, plated with saffron cauliflower puree and pickled cherries. The knife in his hand was a blur. His back perfectly straight, his eyes calm but distant. There was no need to hurry. They would taste. And when they did, the food would speak a truth louder than any insult. He wiped the edge of the next plate clean, placed it on the silver tray, and nodded. Another course was on its way. And with it, the unraveling of every assumption they thought they were clever enough to whisper. The second course arrived like a quiet wave. No flourish. No grand announcement. Just silence. And a plate. Servers moved in perfect choreography, each step as rehearsed as a ballet. They placed the dishes in front of the guests with a practiced bow, retreating swiftly to the perimeter of the room, as though instructed not to interrupt whatever was about to happen. This time, the plate was heavier, warmer. The aroma floated up, subtle, smoky, sweet, teasing the air before the taste could begin. At the center of the dish was a glistening slice of duck breast, cooked to a blushing medium rare, its lacquered surface catching the light like stained glass. A ribbon of molasses thyme glaze trailed beneath it, nestled alongside a golden saffron cauliflower puree, so smooth it might have been mistaken for silk. Bright pickled cherries peeked like jewels from the corner of the plate, balancing the richness with tart precision. At first, there was hesitation. A shared glance across the table. Mrs. Langford raised her brow again, more cautiously this time. Mr. Carmichael chuckled under his breath and leaned in to make another snide comment, but the words didn't come. Not this time. Instead, forks were raised, hands moved, and then stillness. Not a word, not a sound, only the quiet, almost reverent act of chewing. The glaze clung to the tongue, smoky and sweet, opening into layers of flavor, thyme dancing lightly, then retreating as the tongue of cherry cut through. The duck was tender, the fat rendered perfectly, crisp at the edge, buttery beneath. The puree melted on contact, grounding everything in warmth and nostalgia that no one at the table could place, but all somehow recognized, like something half remembered from a childhood meal that was never quite real. Someone gasped. It was soft, more an exhale than a sound. Then a sharp clink as a fork slipped from someone's fingers and struck the edge of the plate. Across the table, Mrs. Langford sat perfectly still, her eyes closed. Her expression had changed completely, the lines of judgment on her face smoothed into something soft, almost fragile. She took another bite, slower this time, as if afraid the food would vanish if she didn't honor it properly. Then came the whisper. "Who made this?" She murmured, barely audible. No one answered. Not right away. But then the kitchen door creaked open. And Chef Malik stepped out. There was no applause, no spotlight. Just the quiet scrape of chairs shifting and the near imperceptible tightening of posture as every guest turned toward him. He walked slowly, deliberately, not proud, not defiant. Just present, just there. His white coat was immaculate, his eyes calm. His presence somehow silenced even the air. Sterling stepped forward from the head of the table, his hands lightly folded. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply said, "The man you just judged with your tongue before your taste." The room went still. A thick pause settled in the air. The weight of what had been said, and what had not, pressed against every chair. Mr. Carmichael's lips parted, as if to say something, but nothing came. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wineglass. Mrs. Langford looked away. Malik's voice, when it came, was steady, quiet, measured. "I trained in Lyon, under Chef Guillaume Vaudin." Gasps rippled through the table. That name Vaudin was legend. A 3 Michelin star master, known for his brutal discipline and his refusal to take anyone under his wing. Except, it seemed, once. "I spent 6 years in his kitchen," Malik continued, "4 of them as sous chef." He paused. "I was offered executive roles, but never given them, not officially. One restaurant told me I didn't look right on the website. Another asked if I could be the face in the back. One recruiter said I was too regional to lead a French dining room in New York." He didn't smile. He didn't need to. "I walked away and opened a culinary school in Atlanta. We trained kids who are told they'd never work in fine dining. Most of them are better than I ever was at their age." He let that sink in. "I cook privately now," he said at last. "Only for those willing to taste without precondition." No one dared speak. The quiet wasn't awkward anymore. It was heavy, respectful, humble. Sterling looked around the room, his eyes moving from one lowered gaze to the next. "You came for flavor," he said softly. "But what you found was something rarer, and perhaps more necessary." Malik gave a nod, not a bow, not a farewell, just a nod, then turned and walked back toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the chamber like a metronome of consequence. The door swung closed behind him, but the silence remained, only now. It was filled with reverence. And shame. And awe, and the slow, undeniable realization that the evening had changed. Not just the way they tasted food, but the way they would taste judgment, too. The echo of the kitchen door closing behind Malik seemed to hang in the air long after he'd disappeared from view. The guests sat frozen, forks idle, wine untouched. No more commentary, no casual laughter, no passive murmurs of judgment disguised as charm. The room, once filled with effortless arrogance, was now hollowed by an unfamiliar presence. Accountability. Mrs. Langford's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water. She stared into the glass as though it might hold a reflection of someone else, someone she didn't quite recognize anymore. The crisp crystal rim caught the light, refracting just enough to shimmer like tears. Next to her, Mr. Carmichael shifted in his seat. His fingers, once so confident around his wineglass, now tapped against the table in restless patterns. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer another joke, another excuse, but found no words. His tongue, for once, failed him. At the far end of the table, a younger guest, a food blogger with a reputation for wit and sarcasm, quietly set her napkin down. She rose slowly, her chair scraping softly against the polished floor. Her eyes were glassy. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply walked out of the room with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to protect the version of her that had come here expecting to laugh. Then came a whisper. "I'm sorry," someone said. The voice was thin, shaky, sincere. It came from a gentleman whose only words earlier had been comparisons and credentials. He now looked straight ahead, eyes slightly wet, as though the meal had peeled something raw inside him, something that food was never meant to reach. And yet somehow had. Another guest leaned forward, hands clasped in front of her mouth, then let out a quiet sigh, not dramatic, just defeated. Or maybe awakened. No one knew where to look. The air had shifted, thickened, not with guilt alone, but with awareness. And in that silence, the memory of their laughter, their remarks, their assumptions, echoed louder than any scolding ever could. Then the door opened again. But not the kitchen door. Edward Sterling, the host, stepped forward from the head of the table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't clear his throat or command attention. He didn't have to. All eyes turned toward him, not out of politeness, but because they needed something to hold on to. He looked at them not as a man disappointed, nor as one angry, but as one who had waited for this moment. He took a slow breath, his voice even, like velvet pressed over stone. "You came here," he began, "to taste something rare." The words hung in the room, resonating like the final notes of a sonata. "And you did." He glanced down the table. No judgment in his eyes, only clarity. "But perhaps what you truly tasted was something rarer still." He paused. Humility. Silence fell deeper. This time not heavy, but cleansing like rain washing dust from a window that hadn't been opened in years. You saw a man you didn't know, and so you filled in the blanks with stereotypes, with mockery, with things you've never dared say aloud to someone you respected. He let that settle, and then you tasted what his hands created. You tasted his discipline, his memory, his pain, his joy, his years. He paced slowly, gently like someone walking among the wounded, and it shook you. He reached the center of the table and rested one hand on the wood. That's the power of true art. It doesn't ask for your permission. It just arrives, and it reminds you, you are not the authority on everything. A beat of silence, then another voice quieter from down the table. "Will he come back?" It was Mrs. Langford. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time all evening, her voice carried no entitlement, just longing and regret. Sterling looked toward the kitchen door, then back at the room. "He came here to cook," he said softly, "not to forgive." There was no cruelty in his tone, only truth. Gave you his best, without a name, without a resume, without expectation. And in return, you gave him doubt, mockery, contempt. He walked back toward his seat, and yet he still served you. The weight of that reality landed like a stone in the center of the room. A few guests dropped their gaze to their laps, as if shielding themselves from the reflection of their own thoughts. Others sat completely still, locked in contemplation, holding forks they could no longer lift. And then, from the kitchen, the faintest sound clinking, the rhythm of plates being washed, knives being dried, the quiet continuation of work, of dignity. Chef Malik had not stayed to witness their unraveling. He didn't need to. His message had already been delivered, not through anger, not through lectures. Through taste, through craft. Through grace. And as the sky outside shifted from gold to twilight, The vineyard bathed in the last light of day. The room remained hushed, not just from fullness, but from a newfound emptiness. Inside each guest, the kind that appears only after a mirror is held too close for too long. And yet, even in that emptiness, something new had begun to take root. Respect. Never judge the hands that feed you by the color of their skin, for greatness wears no uniform you expect. Talent isn't loud, but when it speaks, even pride must listen. Long after the last course had been served, after the clinking of glass had faded, and the final drops of wine had warmed and dulled in their glasses, the guests remained seated, not out of courtesy, but because they no longer knew how to stand. It wasn't hunger that kept them still. It wasn't etiquette. It was reflection. A kind of quiet grief had settled over the table, not for a loss of appetite, but for the smallness of their own assumptions. Each of them had entered this place, certain of their sophistication, wrapped in the comfort of status and experience, insulated by the idea that knowledge of food equaled knowledge of worth. They now understood how wrong they had been. The flavors still lingered on their tongues, haunting and rich. But what lingered more was the silence Chef Malik had left behind. Not just the absence of noise, but the presence of something deeper. Something that filled the room like a hymn no one had asked for. But everyone needed to hear Dot. No one had expected a black man to walk through that kitchen door and silence a room full of power brokers with nothing but a plate of food. No one had expected greatness to arrive without fanfare, without a last name they recognized, without a pedigree printed on an invitation. But that was the point. The lesson hadn't been in the duck, or the puree, or even the perfect balance of acid and smoke. Dot. It had been in the moment after, the stillness that followed. Dot. The moment where pride found itself without defense. Mrs. S. Langford, now unusually quiet, ran her finger along the rim of her wineglass, as though trying to erase the woman she had been an hour ago. She thought of how easily the words had left her lips. Barbecue. Hope there's hot sauce. Spoken with the careless sharpness of someone used to assuming their thoughts were harmless, simply because they were dressed in elegance. She had tasted greatness tonight, and it had tasted nothing like what she expected. It had come from a pair of hands she would have overlooked in a hallway, or worse, dismissed entirely. It made her feel small. But in a way that wasn't meant to humiliate, only to awaken. Across from her, Mr. Carmichael no longer looked smug. The sharp edges of his voice had dulled. His knuckles rested on the table, fingers laced in stillness. For once, the man who had built empires with his words found himself undone by the flavor of humility. And that, perhaps, was the most remarkable thing Chef Malik had done. He had disarmed arrogance without raising his voice. He had exposed ignorance without pointing a finger. He had redefined excellence without ever needing to say his own name. In the kitchen, the night continued like any other. Malik stood alone, rolling a damp cloth over the prep counter with slow, even strokes. He worked without music, without praise, without an audience. The photo near the spice rack still hung slightly. Crooked, his younger self still frozen in that line of white coats. But tonight, he didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He hadn't cooked to prove anything. He hadn't played it justice. He had simply done what he'd always done, what so many like him had done across the world, in kitchens where their stories were never told. He let his work speak. Because talent, real talent, doesn't need to shout. It waits. It endures. And when the time is right, it whispers in flavors that strip away ego and reveal truth. Malik wiped his hands on a towel, took one final glance toward the dining room, then turned off the lights. His shift was over, not just in the kitchen, but in their minds. Outside, the vineyard was bathed in dusk. Crickets had begun their song. The sky, once golden, had deepened into lavender and steel. And beneath that quiet sky, Guests slowly stepped out of the estate one by one, not with the giddy chatter of people who had attended a luxury dinner, but with the hush of those who had witnessed something sacred. Their faces were softer now, their pace slower, and though no one said it aloud, they all understood. They had not come for a meal. They had come for a reckoning, and they would not forget it, because they had learned something that could not be taught by wine pairings or table manners. They had learned that greatness doesn't always arrive in the form they expect. They had learned that the hands that feed them may not look like the ones they applaud, but they should. They had learned that true excellence doesn't need an introduction. It just needs one bite. And if they were lucky, they would never judge the same way again.